The Massachusetts primary election is set for Tuesday, September 4th. Winners there advance to the November 6th general election. There's been a drastic increase in the number of female candidates, such as Tahira Amatul-Wadud, seeking office nationally. Why is that? And what does the field look like for state and local races in Western Massachusetts? I recently spoke with two journalists with insight into this area and more: Robert Rizzuto, assistant managing editor of The Republican and MassLive, and Matt Szafranski, editor and founder of Western Mass Politics and Insight.
Well, I think, the simplest answer, of course, is President Donald Trump. He won election despite having, I think it was by last count, 19 different charges of sexual harassment or worse leveled against him. And you saw the day after his inauguration, by some count, the largest protests in American history. The Women's March. The Women's March, of course. And I think that has motivated a lot of women who might have been on the periphery of politics to actually get involved. And, one of the most direct ways to do that, of course, is to actually run. And, there are training programs that have always existed. They've probably been at capacity these days, so they can actually jump in.
Yeah, I was at the Women's March in D.C. I covered it for the Berkshire Eagle at that time, and I was very surprised to see the mix of women who were down there, the age group, and also the men who were mobilized also to sort of raise their voices around that issue. But I think oftentimes there was a lot of talk anyway around that time about whether or not there would be follow-through. Were you surprised to see a challenger against Richard Neal from within the Democratic Party?
Not so much just from being within the Democratic Party, because we've seen people jump up to kind of challenge him before. But, to see a political newcomer that is a woman step into the ring and say that, she wants to shake things up, it was different than previous challengers. Andrew Nusafaro and some of the other folks that have challenged him in the past. Sometimes the Democrats level a more liberal challenger against him. We've seen that as the party moves further to the left. But she is definitely a new face to politics.
Yes. Matt, you recently wrote on your blog about what it would take to unseat an incumbent. What do you think?
Well, I think, every district is different. That's one thing you have to keep in mind. In Richard Neal's district includes most of Hampden County, Berkshire County, and then like the western fringes of Hampshire and Franklin. So in order for somebody to beat him in a primary, Springfield, which is where he used to be the mayor, is a huge part of that Democratic primary vote. They would need to crack a significant part of his support away, which would not be easy. And then also run up the score in places that are far away from Springfield, because you can't just think of when he was the mayor as his base being in the city. It's also people that used to live in the city that have moved out to the suburbs, some of which may look back on his mayoralty in a positive light. Some may not, but many will. And so it's a very high bar to clear. You've got to crack a lot of people who have been satisfied with his representation, even if people out in the Berkshires and up in the Upper Valley may not have been.
Yeah, and they've criticized him for not getting out there enough, so we'll see. And, we recently saw in the last few years the consolidation. We lost that seat that John Olver held when we did the redistricting of the area. So we'll see where that goes. And before we get too much deeper into a conversation about females coming to the fore here or in the political arena, we did invite a female reporter to join us this week, but scheduling conflicts got in the way, so mansplain away, fellas. Let's look at statewide races for reps and senators. So far, it looks like 3 women are getting into the race there. How does this square with history?
Well, I think what we're seeing statewide is what we're seeing nationally. I think we're going to continue to see more and more of it. It's more and more women are having that follow through, are deciding that I am going to give it a shot. The system needs changing. Who better to change it than me? And they're stepping up and they're taking these leadership roles. And here in Western Mass, they're from both parties.
Yes.
We have Democrats and Republicans. Yeah. So it's across the spectrum. They're showing that I'm not going to fit any one mold just because I'm a woman. But they're stepping up, and they're stepping up in numbers.
Anything you want to add, Matt?
Well, I think what will be interesting to watch is how this interest and surge in women getting into politics runs up against the traditional dynamics that often control a lot of these races. So, for example, in Longmeadow, where the Republican is running, Longmeadow in that district is a perfect example of the kind of places that have been turning against Republicans since the 2016 election. So, is her interest and enthusiasm going to be enough to overcome that? Meanwhile, the other one out in Palmer, Sturbridge, that's become a very Republican area as those areas have drifted away from the Democratic Party. Will her interest and enthusiasm and backing be enough to overcome that dynamic? That's something that's going to be very interesting to watch.
We'll see how this unfolds as the days and weeks steam ahead toward November. Let's look at Stan Rosenberg. He has been a highly regarded representative in this area. Currently, his husband is facing some allegations of sexual misconduct, and there's a question about whether or not his husband used undue influence, wielded Senator Rosenberg's influence in the state Senate. Do you think that this then opens up a lane for someone else to get involved in this race?
I think that Senator Rosenberg is still widely popular, beloved from Democrats and basically his entire district. I don't want to say that anyone's untouchable, because that's not politically true, just generally speaking, but I think he's pretty safe.
I would agree. There is it's not just they like him, as a Democrat or as a long-term. He's been there for 25 years, just as a senator, even longer if you include state rep, and then working for John Olver before that. But they appreciate his wonkiness. He likes diving into the details, and you have a lot of people. I mean, he represents how many colleges up in that district? These are people who devour the kind of things that he thrives on in the State House. So it's going to be very hard for somebody to gather together a coalition that could overcome him in a Democratic primary, and that district isn't electing anybody but a Democrat anytime soon.
And you don't think that the Republican Party would see this as an opportunity to really rally a candidate there? Not even going to touch it?
No, I think they'd rather spend their money somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, I don't think that anybody expected Stan Rosenberg to lose the Senate presidency and also be stripped of all of his committee assignments, which we've seen transpire in recent weeks. This
particular scandal would have to escalate considerably further than it already has. It would have to come right in into his own control, something that he actually did. There's definitely some damage of trust among some of the senators there, but that's not the point at which they're going to start calling for a colleague to resign entirely or not run. Let's pivot here. Interesting news from the former governor, Bill Weld, who is suing to make a change that would have actually a national impact if it were to move forward. And it looks at the election system. He wants to change the winner-take-all system that's currently in place regarding presidential elections. We're talking really here about the difference between the popular vote and the electoral college, right? Yes.
And so what would be the implication?
There's two different ways that you could break it down. You could have like a percentage of the vote determine how many of the popular vote goes to the winner either way. And then another way that is technically done in Maine and Nebraska, where the winner of the entire state gets the 2 electoral college votes that represent the Senate seats, and then the winner of individual congressional districts get that seat's electoral college vote. So it really kind of depends like which would fall down, which the plaintiffs think is more equitable or what they would want to see. That it could really change it one way or the other dramatically, especially because some states have very few seats. But if you have a percentage base, even rather than by congressional district, that could make a difference in your 1-seat congressional states. And why do you think that former Governor Weld is coming forward with this issue now?
Well, I think as you saw, with former Governor Weld's own presidential run, in days before the election, he just flat out called on people to vote for Hillary Clinton, who was a Democrat, despite him previously being a Republican, because he didn't think that Donald Trump was right for the country. I think that this kind of follows in that vein, but what we've seen in this lawsuit is Massachusetts and California, both of which the popular vote went for Hillary, and South Carolina and Texas, both of which states went for Donald Trump, all joining this lawsuit. And I think it reflects what we're seeing in some of the national polling that's been trending for a few years now, that support for the Electoral College is extremely low. I think people generally do feel it diminishes their power. It takes away from their ability to elect people of their choosing to the office of presidency.
Right, and do you think that ends up affecting voter turnout when people feel like, my vote doesn't matter anyway?
In some states, definitely. I think I was looking at some of these numbers recently for local elections, and for a long time, Springfield, just to use as one example, Massachusetts is a blue state. It's only voted Republican for Ronald Reagan in the last 30, 40 years. Springfield's turnout for presidential elections was like in the low to mid 40s. 2008 comes around, you have Barack Obama, who really energized a lot of people, it shoots up to 50,000. And Elizabeth Warren, partly because of her campaign in 2012, as for running for Senate, and then Hillary Clinton in 2016, they keep it at that level. So people were interested on a level that they hadn't been before, but it was because of very different kinds of races. It wasn't the same humdrum presidential race. So yes, the idea that your vote doesn't matter for a presidential contest, I think does depress turnout in some cases.
We'll see where this lawsuit goes. As you say, 4 states right now are looking at the issue, and which could really have a national impact. Let's look to Florida, the mass shooting. We continue to hear conversations this week. Unfortunately, it seems like a bit of a pattern. There's a mass shooting, then there is anger, hurt, trauma, frustration, obviously all very warranted, and then a lot of discussion, but not a whole lot of action. Seems like this time around, the big potential change maker are these students. We've seen them go to Washington. We've seen them go to their own state capital. Do you think that these students, the protests, the voices that these kids are raising, could make a difference around this issue?
I think they could. I'm guess generally cynical that nationally anything's ever going to be done because of the support for gun rights is so strong and the gun lobby. So I'm kind of questionable if any meaningful difference will be made. But if anyone's going to do it, these young people are pushing really hard. This is a group of engaged, tech-savvy young people who know how to use social media. They know how to speak to people, and they know how to engage. There was a kind of town hall discussion last night with Senator Marco Rubio, and some of these kids were very, very eloquent in their approach. And I think it's that kind of modern, tech-savvy, numbers-driven approach that is going to make a difference, if anything is.
To your point about tech-savvy, here in Western Massachusetts, I've seen students mobilizing connected to the Women's March. There's a movement called #Enough, which will have a national walkout on March 14th. And at last check, there were at least 8 schools in Western Massachusetts who have students that intend to walk out on that day in solidarity. Any thoughts, Matt?
Well, the only thing I would add is that I think what's going to be really decisive is are they prepared to keep at it through whatever frustration is going to come, because there might be some minimal changes short term, but they've already said that those aren't going to be enough. And it's going to take, I think, some election cycles, maybe some of these kids to age into voting themselves to make the kind of changes that they're actually seeking. So I think, Rob's right to be cynical in the short term. I don't think we're going to see dramatically better background checks or assault weapons bans this year, but this might be different in the sense that we might see it 2, 3, 4 years from now, whereas a month ago, nobody would have ever thought that was possible.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.